Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live video series. And joining me today to share the stories behind the 10 books that, quote, were roadside assistants on his soul journey is former lecturer in ancient history at the Australian National University, founder of the School of Active Dreaming, and New York Times bestselling novelist, poet, journalist, independent scholar, teacher, dream traveller, Robert Moss, whose numerous books on dreaming include Dreaming the Soul Back Home, Shamanic Dreaming for Healing and Becoming Whole, Conscious Dreaming, Active Dreaming, The Dreamer's Book of the Dead, The Three Only Things, Mysterious Realities, and more. Robert Moss, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be dreaming and reading with you, Sandie.
Indeed. So, as somebody who lives with an extended book family of around 14,000 volumes, we know that books have a very meaningful place in your life. So tell us a little bit about your love affair with books.
Well, it starts in childhood, of course, as all good love affairs probably might. I had a strange childhood. I mean, I was pronounced clinically dead when I was 3 years old. When I came back, the doctor said with some embarrassment to my parents, "Oh, your boy died and he came back, didn't he?" Well, he did come back, but I really wasn't very much at ease in this world. I had pneumonia in both lungs 12 times over the next 8 years. I was often in sick rooms. So what were and I'm an only child. What are my friends? My friends are the friends of my imagination and the books that I can lay hands on. So I became a great reader. I had a lot of time for reading. And when I was out and about, I get on my bike, the old bike with the basket on the handlebar, and I go to the local library sale or the church sale, and I come back with 20 paperbacks and spent all my pocket money adding to the books until they really overfilled my bedroom wherever we were staying. So it starts in childhood. And all of my life, I've had a need to physically possess books. I hope this is not some kind of perversion, but I mean, I read a lot of on screen like everybody else does these days, and I do research on screen with on-screen materials, but I like to have a book in my hands. I like to touch it. I like to stroke it. I like to caress it. I like to smell it. If it hasn't been moldy, that's a horror for me, the smell of mold on books that have been improperly stored. And above all, I like to interact with a pencil. I read pencil in hand, whatever it is. And I don't hesitate, unless it's an extremely valuable, rare book, to write in my books, to write notes, to underline things. And that means I can go back to a book after years and open up immediately the key passages that I thought were important, then come back to me. And, delivery men turn up at my door almost every day with books. And occasionally, if they're feeling cheeky, they'll say something like, "Oh, like you need another book, eh?" And I'll say, "Well, of course I need another book, of course." So I live in this extended family. And as some of our group will understand, you have a lot of books around you and you love them. There's a life not only in the books, but around the books. Arthur Koestler talked about the library angel, defining that kind of entity associated with books who makes books appear or disappear in mysterious and magical ways. I think of shelf elves. They'll make a book fall off the shelf, literally, almost throw one at me one day, saying, "Look at this, time to look at this," or they'll disappear something because it's not time. And on top of the shelf elves, whenever I read in the middle of the night, I've usually got a cat around me. I've got cats and dogs in my house. I love both. And my current cat, Lucy, who came to me in a most mysterious way, recently decided that she would lick the spine of a book about traveling with Borges. It's a book by a man who was a young writer, traveled with Borges in Scotland. He didn't know who Borges was, this great Argentine writer, and he was a student just out of college in Pennsylvania. And he's sort of, he's assigned to drive Borges around Scotland for a week. It's a book called Borges and Me. Lucy licks the spine of the book, pats it with approval. I turn the page, and on the next page is a scene where Borges is in the Carnegie Library, donated by the American tycoon Andrew Carnegie in Scotland, and he's blind, and he's brought into the central rare book room where there are rare editions of Sir Walter Scott, and he takes a book off the shelf and he licks the spine. And the very correct Scottish librarian can't believe what he's seeing. Here's this man who's told he's a professor, former head of the National Library. He says, "This is impossible, sir. You can't be licking the books." And I look at Lucy, my cat, and I think, this is more than minor synchronicity. This is literary synchronicity of a high order. Not only did she approve the book, she licked the spine, and then a page or two later, there is Borges, the subject of the book, licking the spine of a book in Scotland. So this is beyond sort of routine magic. This is pretty good feline and literary magic. So this is the way that I live, with my books all around me. And of course, in these shutdown pandemic times, I'll be up all night sometimes with piles of books on the upright piano that is my bookside table in my reading corner, moving back and forth between different topics and reading interesting stuff, interesting new fiction, interesting non-fiction of many kinds. And this is a lovely way to spend the middle of the night.
I can just see Lucy doing that and then looking at you as if to say, now what are you going to make of that?
Well, she followed up. Let me give you another clue. The next day, she's looking at the piles of books on the piano stool. Nobody plays the piano at the moment. And she paused at a copy of the Arabian Nights, a recent translation of the Arabian Nights. I had just been reading about Borges' lifelong love of the Arabian Nights and how he said that all his best ideas really came from the Arabian Nights. And in a sense, Borges being Borges, he said, in a sense, I wrote them. I wrote the Arabian Nights. That's the way he talked about things. So Lucy wants me to move from Borges to the Arabian Nights. So I did. I started reading that translation again. I'd taken it up, put it down. But thanks to Lucy the cat, a shelf elf with 4 paws, my reading choice for that moment was made.
I love that. You can sit in your chair. Lucy, and down comes a book.
The cat, she doesn't come like a dog. She'll decide. She does what she wishes to do. She'll decide whether she's going to choose a book or whether she's going to come or go. That's how she is.
I bet she was a librarian in her former life.
I don't know. I think she might have been beyond librarian. Of course, she might have been the goddess of the great library of Alexandria or something like that. I mean, cats have a high opinion of themselves. You probably
They do. They do. So with 14,000 volumes to choose from, how did you arrive at your 10?
Arrive at my what?
Your 10.
Oh, my 10. Oh, well, you said if you just said, give a list of 10 books that will give people some spiritual inspiration, I would have come up with 10 immediately. And they would have been somewhat different from the list of 10 I gave you, but you said something about relating the books that you recommended to your own life passages. So I thought about what were some of the books that gave me orientation, confirmation, or even models of understanding. Things that were going on in my life in moments of what we could call spiritual emergence. It could be spiritual emergency, it could be real crisis, it could be Jung's confrontation with the unconscious. And there are several books that were very important to me half a lifetime ago when I changed my life radically and became a dream teacher. So those are on the list. But then I thought back to the crises of childhood. I thought about books that I loved then. Of course, I'm a boy. I loved adventure stories, Rider Haggard, Captain Horatio Hornblower, all this stuff that boys of my generation liked to read. But something that grabbed me very early on was the Odyssey. I probably read it in a very simple kids edition to begin with, and then I read it in more complicated editions, and then I started dreaming in Homeric Greek. And although my Greek never became very good, I used to keep a dictionary of ancient Greek, Homeric Greek, in my bedroom to look up the words I could manage to deal with. And, as life went on, I'd go back to the Odyssey. I've gone back to it recently because there's a wonderful recent translation by Emily Wilson, which is very accessible. It's poetic, but it's also clean and clear. And what is this? Well, it's an adventure story, but it's about more than a wounded warrior who comes out of a war and starts off behaving badly and then loses his crew and gets shipwrecked and then has passionate romantic affairs with goddess beings on islands in the ocean, and then can't get home again and fights sea monsters and washes up on the Phaeacian shore and comes home, and coming home is difficult. So it's a story of the quest, but it's a story of a quest that unfolds within a world of women, within a world of feminine wisdom and feminine healing and feminine challenge, because women of power can be terrifying to men, as our readers probably know. And some of the women in this book are more terrifying than the sea monsters. Think of Circe, or even Calypso, beautiful than she is, very hard to get away from. And as I've looked at the book, I understood this relatively early in my life, probably by the end of my teens. What the book is really about is a relationship between someone who's going through the Odyssey of life, the journey of life, under the protection, with the friendship of a greater power. And I'm getting shivers as I say this to you, it's really the story of the hero and the goddess. And it's written more from a feminine perspective than a male one. Like, look, guy, you've got to brighten up, you've got to shave up, you've got to get yourself sorted out. You have to be healed and repaired and balanced in the realm of women. The friend who gets Odysseus through is Athena, it's the goddess Athena. And I feel that as far as goddesses or archetypes are concerned, I've known her for as long as I've known the Odyssey, for as long as I've known Odysseus. I have felt her personal presence in my life. I was in a very difficult situation in Turkey some years ago. I wrote a story about, a very funny story, I think, in my book, Mysterious Realities, which is about my travels in this world and other worlds. I felt actually the protective hand of Athena over me, very much as Odysseus felt it. I felt her owl eyes giving me the ability to see into dark places and find my way through. So in the relationship between the hero and the goddess in the Odyssey, we have a very interesting model and a dramatic model, a very readable, accessible model of what it is to be graced and blessed, even if you don't understand it part of the time, by the protection and the interest and the saving power of the goddess or archetype of your life. So that's really what drew me to the Odyssey and has drawn me back. And Athena appears in many forms. Odysseus says at one point, "It is hard to know you, goddess, because you show yourself in so many shapes. In one moment, she's shown skimming the surface of the wine-dark sea like a sea bird." So that's one of her forms. And she will turn up in a dream. She turns up, it's a book about dreams too. Dreams are absolutely central to the plot of the Odyssey. When Odysseus is washed up on the Phaeacian shore, which is a sort of liminal realm between sleep and awake, between dream and ordinary physical reality, the princess Nausicaa is prepared for what would otherwise look like a naked brute washed up on the iron-bound shore, because Athena appears in her dream under the disguise of her friend. The goddess puts on a mask. I'm not going to show myself as Athena. That might be too much for you, or you might not believe it. I'm going to show up as a friend that you trust, and I'm going to tell you, a stranger will be on the beach tomorrow. Go down in the morning and look after him. So that's how Odysseus begins to be reintroduced into the world that does not have sea monsters or sorceress goddesses like Circe, a world that is more like that of humans. It's a dream that helps to bring him back, and the dream is given by a goddess who puts on the mask of an ordinary human in order to reach a human mind. So all of this has lived with my imagination since, I don't know, 9 years old, 10 years old, something like that. But there's a pleasure in going back to books that you wrote a long time ago. There's a pleasure in going back to classics. We mustn't think that we know it all, because we grow, our perspective grows, we find new treasures underground that we thought was thoroughly trodden, and there's nothing more there to be found. There always is. So I actually like going back and rereading things.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, you can do this with some books, and each time you can read them many times and find something new every time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So book number 2, the collected poems, William Butler Yeats, first published in 1950. When did you read that book the first time?
Well, I grew up on Yeats. I can't tell you when I first knew a Yeats poem. I might have heard one before I read one. My mother's people were from Ireland, and a little bit of Yeats is with anyone who knows Ireland. So I probably heard some Yeats poems, probably the simple ones. I shall arise and go now and go to Innisfree, those simple ones that lap like lake water. I seem to remember a scratchy old LP. I can't swear now that it was Yeats himself on the recording, but I remember someone reading Yeats's poems on that scratchy LP I bought in some rather rubbishy store in Sydney when I was a boy on holiday. I got the collected edition that I mentioned as the Ellis Prize for Verse. They always give the benefactor's name for writing poetry when I was finishing my secondary school, Canberra Grammar School in Canberra, Australia. So this is my first collected edition of Yeats. I have others now, and there are bigger ones, and they're edited and all that. But that one has a great, obviously, personal value for me. And of all the poems in it, and I read most of them, and I can recite many of them, the one that I still love best is the one that speaks to the soul and heart of many people when they hear it. Shall I say it to you? Would you?
Yes, please.
The Song of Wandering Angus. Probably everybody knows this or knows a bit of it or remembers it. Here from the heart of Western literary tradition is a wildly shamanic song about soul and the need to care for soul and get it in the right place. And it's about shape-shifting, which, of course, is a great Celtic thing. The Song of Wandering Angus. Angus in Irish tradition is a love god and a god of dreams. I shall arise and go now. Oh, no, I'm going back to Innisfree. I'm going back to Innisfree. I started out with Innisfree. Now we'll go to the Song of Wandering Angus. I went out to a hazel wood because the fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow land and hilly land, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips, and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck, till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. So that poem's been with me for a long time, and I've probably been saying it like that since I was in my mid-teens, maybe even younger. And when I think about, what the soul journey, anybody's soul journey is about, when I think about how important it is to find where the different pieces of us might be and bring them together, because everybody from a shamanic perspective, and I follow a shamanic path, has suffered what shamans call soul loss. We suffer pain, we suffer abuse, we suffer disappointment, we suffer betrayal, we make bad choices. We fail to follow our own best dreams, and part of us goes away because it's sad. The world seems too cold and cruel, or it thinks we're useless because we've given up. We compromised and given up, sold out. So part of us goes away. And in that poem is the promise that it's possible to call back a part of soul that might have gone missing. I will find out where she has gone. And there's the potency, the magic of being able to change forms. And the business about the apples is great because, the apples are a passport to the other world for Celts and for other people. And I've certainly seen them that way. Another of my favorite books from childhood was actually called Martin Pippin and the Apple Orchard.
I remember that.
And Martin comes to a gate, and the price of getting through the gate where all the girls are laughing at him is to come up with a story. So so I always think of the Apple Gate, the apples as a gift of story as well as all else. Of course, Yeats did many things. He was a playwright. He was briefly a senator, though he didn't prosper in politics at all. He was a magus. He was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and formed his own Celtic mystery order and was deeply engaged in trying to understand the secret order of events and to influence it. And one of his great lifetime ambitions was to write a Book of the Dead, a Western Book of the Dead. He had to go at it a couple of times in a book which was called A Vision, and its two editions are radically different, and both are almost impenetrable for anybody, even a Yeats lover, to get into. But in that, too, I find that I follow and resonate with Yeats. When I was writing the book of mine that was published as The Dreamer's Book of the Dead, which you were kind enough to mention, Yeats himself turned up, and he said in his slightly lilting speech, very English, not very Irish, really. He was very more Anglo than Irish, so they loved the Irish. What better guide to the other side than a poet? So when I was writing that book, I felt the presence of Yeats, as Dante found the presence of Virgil when he was writing the comedy. So I could unhesitatingly put Yeats as my second selection as a book. Well, I chose his collected poems rather than any of his other books, although I love his essays and autobiographies and so on, because it had a commanding influence over my attitude towards life, which is also a somewhat magical attitude. Yeats said the visible is the skin of the invisible. The visible is the skin of the invisible. Behind the visible is another world with its own beings and its own powers, which is right there, just waiting for us to grow our perception. And that has been my attitude all of my life too. So in that magical attitude towards life and the nearness of the other world, I felt a deep affinity for this marvelous author.
You said that you learned the truth of his conviction that kindred spirits reach to each other across time and may generate a mingling of minds.
Yes, that's a phrase that he gave us in one of his essays, and he wrote about it from his personal experience. It's been my experience too. You might have it when you're reading. You find yourself resonating with an author, maybe a long dead author, to such an extent that you feel as if some part of their intelligence, some part of their memory has become open to you. You might even feel in their presence, as I felt Yeats, as I'm not saying with the individual spirit of Yeats, but something of the essence of his life and work and teaching and his style of explaining things. So I think it's one of the great moments in life when you feel what he called the mingling of minds, or what his friend A.E. George Russell called spiritual gravitation. You're in a certain way, you're following a certain line of study, you're following a certain line of passionate work or interest. You call corresponding influences to you. So that's something that Yeats confirmed for me.
Book number 3, very interesting book. I have not read this one. I have read some of her books. Secrets of Dr. Taverner by Dion Fortune, published in 1926.
Yeah.
Tell us about that one.
Well, I love Dion Fortune, and I feel a great personal affinity for her. And I've read, I think, everything by her that's been published in a regular way. There's some things of hers that haven't been published, which I've not seen yet. And when I had to choose one title, I thought, well, it's got to be Dr. Taverner. In some ways, The Sea Priestess, one of her novels, is probably a superior work as a work of literary craft and style. And of course, she wrote a lot of books about real magic, real Kabbalah. Psychic Self-Defense is the one that most people know. It's actually a terrifying book. It's not a beginner's book. It's a practitioner.
I know. It is terrifying.
That book will give you nightmares. It's a thrilling book to read, but I think, oh dear, if you're just trying to sort of clean up your act and have a low maintenance policy of psychic protection, this is probably not where you want to start. Dion herself, Violet Firth was her birth name. Dion Fortune was a magical name. She's a priestess of the Western way. She said at one point that the real practice is in her fiction, not in her nonfiction. And I think that's true when you look at what's going on in the stories of Dr. Taverner. She modeled Dr. Taverner, who's a sort of soul doctor in tweeds. He's got a sort of country clinic. He's got his tie and his tweeds and looks like a regular color country fellow, but he's actually a magus. He's actually a magician. He's actually a sort of British shaman. He's modeled on a man she worked with. I think they had a falling out at some point, but I think she still admired him at the time that she wrote the book. And he deals in things which I think it's very important to understand. Just for life, you don't have to be on an overtly spiritual path to want to understand about how you lose energy, how there are energy vampires, for example. It's very good about that. You want to know that, you can travel beyond the body, consciously or unconsciously. You might do it every night in dreams. Some part of you might be traveling beyond your body. Certainly ancient and indigenous people believe this. And you might get yourself into trouble. If you're traveling outside the body in a subtle vehicle, an etheric or astral body, you might get into trouble that might have to be looked at. Your life might turn upon dramas being played out in other places and times, and connections with people who've come back at the same time as you, but don't necessarily appreciate you all that much. There might be an ancient Egyptian story or something else playing. So in the Taverner stories, in The Secrets of Dr. Taverner, Dion Fortune describes in an animated, accessible, and sometimes quite thrilling way the kinds of issues that might require special treatment, the treatment of the attention of a soul doctor or a Western shaman, let's say, because they concern the protection, the well-being, the preservation even of the soul in its various vehicles. It's a very good read. I've gone back to that many times, and I used to actually recommend essays from it to some of my advanced groups. So that's why I picked that. But I also picked Dion Fortune overall because she is a priestess of the Western way who understood many things. She understood, for example, she wrote about this quite openly, that when it comes to approaching death, something we all need to do, if you're on a spiritual path or just a life path, you have to make some kind of arrangement with death and understand your death in some way or other. She said very directly that where you go in dreams is where you go after death. Pay attention. It's pretty much the same thing. She said that in the same way that an indigenous shaman would talk about it amongst the North American tribes that I know. You're getting ready for death if you pay attention to your dreams, because you understand that something of you travels beyond the body. It goes to places that you might find again when you enter the big dream beyond physical life.
Do you remember when you first discovered Dion Fortune's work?
Well, not exactly, but I've always known tarot. So there's a tarot connection. She designed her own tarot deck, of course, and worked with the Golden Dawn deck before that. And the decks that the deck I first worked with, like most people who come across tarot, was the old Rider-Waite deck.
Yes.
First deck that reached Australia. I don't think we had any tarot decks in Australia. And I found that in a bookshop when I was in my teens, my mid-teens, maybe 14 or 15. Of course, I got it and didn't show my parents what I was doing. They might not like it. They're pretty relaxed, but they might not like it. And so, what some tarot practitioners would say, and I'm sure Dion Fortune would say, is that if you work with tarot, you might find that you have that mingling of minds that we were talking about earlier, that connection with previous practitioners or designers, or those who've used the deck in different ways. Of course, in mystery orders like Dion Fortune's, the tarot was used not just for divination or card reading, but as the model for ritual and for archiving, in a sense, archiving memory, the magic of memory, archiving things in a certain way. So tarot was absolutely familiar to me before I ever spread the cards, before I ever laid eyes on a Rider-Waite deck. I knew it. And some of my dreams of Dion Fortune, which used to come rich and strong many years ago, I don't think I've dreamed of her recently, but in some of my dreams of Dion Fortune, I would see the use of tarot images and tarot symbols for path working, for journeying on the inner planes through a certain map defined by the tarot trumps, for example. I sort of knew this, but it all came alive. And I reached the point very early on where I could do the tarot reading in my mind without needing the cards. And I would, when working with people privately, which I no longer do, but when I did that privately, often I just noticed, okay, the situation being laid out for me in, let's say, a Celtic cross spread with maybe one of the decks that I normally use, or maybe the images of it different being laid out in my mind. And Dion Fortune herself, in Understanding of Tarot, talked about that. I mean, the real process, the real magic is conducted on the plane of imagination more than on the physical plane. She also said that real initiation, although she did a lot of ceremonial magic, but she also said that real initiation takes place on a spiritual plane, and that all the things we see that have to do with gods and spirits and mysteries are contact pictures from the larger reality, just as the tarot cards are contact pictures, images that we can play with of the deeper forces at work in our lives. So I wanted to honor her influence in my life, which was huge. I mean, I felt, in a sense, although of course I never knew her, I was born around the time that she died. There was a few months of separation. But I've always felt an affinity for her. Amongst all the famous names of people in the Anglo-American mystery movements, she was always the one that I identified with and felt at home with.
Well, book number 4 is one that I would think very few people have come across. Jesuit Relations and Allied Documents, Travels and Explorations of the Jesuit Missionaries in New France.
Yes, New France, well said.
Yes.
Well, I hesitated before putting this in a list of 10 books because it's a 73-volume set, which is on my shelves, of course. And I'll tell you the story of how it comes to be, then why I would be even interested in the first place. In 73 volumes, published in 1903, of bilingual, French and Latin on one page, English on the other, of reports from Jesuits in what is now Quebec, Ontario, and New York. Oh, and some of New England too, the northeast corner of North America. Well, when I moved to a farm in this general area because of a white oak tree and a red-tailed hawk that dropped a feather between my legs, I started dreaming in a language I did not understand. In fact, I was called in a lucid dream in the middle of the night, in which I found myself flying like a hawk, seemingly on the wings of a hawk, to a cabin in the woods somewhere near Montreal. And there is a native woman. She's elderly but beautiful, speaking to me in a cadence language I do not understand, stroking a beaded belt, a wampum belt, I used to call it, learned to call it, with a she-wolf and 2 human figures on it, Romulus and Remus, no different culture. And anyway, this started a string of visions and synchronicity, which led me to understand that she was an ancient woman of power, born Huron, adopted by the Mohawk Indians, famous, fierce Mohawk people who rose to become mother of the Wolf clan historically 250 years ago. I was engaged with an Anglo-Irishman who came to the American colonies in the 18th century, with whom I have a distant family connection, family in terms of pedigree, bloodlines, and affinity in other ways. So something from another time, something to do with the spirits of the land, something to do with an ancestral connection through the bloodlines back to Ireland had come into my life. It had drawn me into the ambit, into the mental range of a powerful shaman of a native tradition. By the way, in the Mohawk Indian language, the word for shaman, Radzedzots, means dreamer, one who dreams. That is what they call the shaman. The primary qualification is you dream. You dream strong. They also use it for healer. You are a dreamer. So I needed to understand what was going on. I needed to understand Sir William Johnson, the Anglo-Irishman. I went to Ireland to do that. I went to the scene of his birth in Smithtown, County Meath. And I needed to understand what was going on with the native people with whom he was engaged deeply. He lived amongst the Mohawk Indians on what was the Wild East, not the Wild West yet, but the Wild East in American history. What's going on with them? And there are some funny words from what the woman of power said to me that my contemporary Mohawk-speaking people could not translate. Said, Robert, you're hard to understand. It's not just your funny Anglo-Australian accent, but you're talking archaic stuff. This isn't the vocabulary we use today. It's like listening to Shakespearean English. It's old, and there's some Huron in it. Well, I'm researching this. I like to do my research. I started out as a history professor. I didn't stay there formally, but I've never given up reading and studying things. I'm engaged in this, and up at my house, at the farmhouse where I was then living, up appears a used book dealer. I am beloved of used book dealers. You can't imagine why. I got to know him. He had a nice place in what they call the Berkshires, not the Berkshires. The Berkshires are western Massachusetts. And Pug, as his friends called him, turns up in a pickup truck. And I look, this is interesting. I've never seen him in a pickup truck. Oh, I'll show you why, Robert. He's got these crates of books, 73 volumes of the Jesuit Relations. I've heard about them. I've seen them quoted, but I've never seen the set. He said, I believe there are only 2 sets in private hands. This will be the third. It fallen out the back door of a Midwestern university. Are you going to buy them? I did. I had a few pennies to rub together in those days, or I thought I did. And even if I didn't, I had to have them. So now I've got these reports, and under you've got Jesuit missionaries in the wildwoods amongst very fierce American Indian peoples who are sometimes burning them to death, not in large numbers, but enough to discourage the others, who are worshipping what? They can't see gods exactly. They see animals, they see spirits, they see ghosts, they see dreams. One of the things they're saying about the Iroquoian peoples, which means the Huron and the 6 nations of the Longhouse, including the Mohawk, one of the things that the Jesuit observers are saying about the people they're trying to convert is they believe in dreams. It's like their God is dreams. They say the dream world is the real world. My kind of stuff. All my life, this is my kind of stuff. And then there's one of the funny words from the conversation with the mother of the Wolf Clan. I could not get anyone to interpret. It sounds like this, ondinunk. And no one can interpret. We don't know that word, Robert. There it is in a report sent back in a winter in the 1600s by a Jesuit to his superiors. They say, meaning these Iroquoian peoples, like the Mohawk, like the Huron, they say the most important thing to know about dreams is that they show us the secret wishes of the soul. They show us what the soul wants, and by implication, what we should fulfill, or else the soul might go away. And so you begin, once you understand that word and that concept, that dreams show you the secret wishes of the soul, you've got a better handle on this than most Western psychology has ever given us. You might jump to the conclusion, wait a minute, if that is true, then what do we do about that? Maybe we get around, we sit quietly with each other and hear the dreams and help each other to understand, what is the soul saying? What is your purpose as the soul would like you to live it? What does your soul desire as opposed to your ego and the grocery list of ordinary requirements and expectations? Maybe you should follow soul. And the other thing I learned from these reports, which are sometimes fantastically vivid, there's a carapace, there's a veil of fear and belief that the demon, the devil is loose in the American woods and so on. But if you get beyond that, these are early anthropologists. Actually, the first recognizable anthropologist was a Jesuit priest from this period. The first anthropologists, they're pretty smart people. So there's the religious prejudice, and then there's the fear. But beyond that, through the veil, through the mesh, if you look, is a rich account of the spiritual practices of Native American people near the time of first contact. I mean, this is precious, but you got to know how to read it. The other thing that you get when you read it is dreaming is also about survival, because here are people who are hunter warriors facing imported disease, constant warfare, They are looking to their dreamers to tell them where the enemy lies in ambush. They're looking to their dreamers to tell them where the deer can be found in midwinter when the people are starving. So you begin to understand two things. Dreaming's about soul and it's about survival. So these books, which were my favorite nighttime reading for months, were part of my way. I'm not going to recommend that anybody rushes out and tries to find the 73 volumes of Jesuit Relations, though these days you can probably get it online. But to play author for a moment, my book, Dreamways of the Iroquois, as they say in Canada. In America, they say Dreamways of the Iroquois, but Dreamways of the Iroquois has the essence of what I learned from that research and those encounters.
I love that they taught their children that dreams are the single most important source of practical and spiritual guidance.
Exactly.
Well, I have to say, Robert, we've had a number of people who've sneaked in more than 10 books by doing the collected works of a favourite author, but you win the trophy with 73. I don't know if anyone could top it.
I thought it was too outrageous. I thought, no, because there's a good story. And if it got story value, I'm always going to go with it.
Of course. And everything around it, the synchronicity. I mean, you've got to pay attention to that.
Yes, you do. I live by synchronicity. And the used book, he knew my interest, obviously, or else he wouldn't have driven over with these volumes. But the way they came to him, then the way he arrived at dusk at the farmhouse, and there's a strange thing going on in the sky. It's probably a vapor trail, but as if there's a feather all across the sky in the place that I bought because a hawk dropped a feather between my legs. That's what he turns up with these books. So those books were precious.
I'm sure. Okay, so book number 5, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, C.G. Jung, 1961.
Yes, I love Jung. I'm not a Jungian. Jung was not a Jungian. I'm not a Jungian either, but I love Jung. I've been reading Jung since I was in secondary school. I can't say exactly when I started, but by the time I got to the second year of my undergraduate days, I'd read much of the collected works, not always understanding, I must say, what I was reading. I mean, the alchemical works and so on are pretty formidable stuff. But the book then and now that I always recommend to others to read, I reread myself from time to time, is this memoir. It was actually mostly dictated by Jung in his old age to his assistant Agnella Jaffe. He wrote some of it himself, but it's mostly Jung's voice as recorded, transcribed by Agnella. It is, I would say, the simplest, most dramatic, most exciting, most accessible introduction to Jung's works. And when it comes to Jung's work, I'm actually far more interested in Jung as a practitioner than as a theorist. I mean, we know that Jung gave us all sorts of models for personality types, became famous for that, intuitive, feeling, thinking, etc., sensory. We know that he gave us a theory of synchronicity, which is great. I can say synchronicity, and people look at me as if I'm saying something scientific and respectable. If I say coincidence, they don't know how to deal with it. So Jung as a classical scholar as well as a scientist gave us a lot of useful phrases. He popularized the word archetype. He didn't develop it, he didn't invent it. And people look a bit more interested, as if you're respectable and scientific and scholarly if you say archetype rather than if you say the goddess is here. If you say the archetypes are in play, you get less skeptical looks. So Jung's theories are well worth studying, and his literacy and his scholarship are immense. And now we have the Red Book, but the Red Book is a crazy-making book. I read the Red Book in 3 days and 3 nights. I thought I was going as crazy as Jung did. By the end of it, I wanted to throw it across the room, but it's as big as a tombstone. I would have broken the furniture, and it cost me a lot of money, so I didn't. The memories, dreams, reflections actually make sense out of the primal experiences of his life that were the material, the prima materia, the primary material for his work, which was the years of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. But in some senses, he went, in the eyes of the world, he went crazy. I mean, he went into the underworld and he didn't come back for years. But he came back, and that's the difference between the shaman and the madman, isn't it? Or the mystic, or between Jung and the madman. You come back, you go, you submerge, you are drowned for a while, and you come back. He came back. So reading Memories, Dreams, Reflections, you have a marvelous story of a man's search to understand the nature of soul, the understanding of spirit, the understanding of self, and help others to find that. And you also see page by page, episode by episode, how dreams guided all of his life. He says, dreams are the facts from which we must proceed. And he says also in this memoir, I have interesting thoughts all day long, but I take up in my work only that to which my dreams direct me. That is how he lived. And you see page by page, I am the same. I would add, as Jung would say if he were revising it, I take up in my work that to which dreams and synchronicity directly, synchronicity as well, which is what we have dreaming with your eyes open. This literally drives most of my research. And it was the same for Jung. You can see, as I say, you can see it page by page. Yes, he's Herr Dr. Professor Jung. Yes, he's sometimes giving lectures. Yes, he's sometimes seeing clients. But he's always alert to the wind on the water, to the fox that appears in the wood. He tells the now famous story to those of us who follow these things. How he's trying to help a woman whose therapies have all failed. And she starts telling him a dream about an Egyptian scarab, which you don't get in Europe. But Jung is always alert to his environment. He looks, and at the window there is a flying beetle, a green gold beetle, a rose chafer beetle, the closest thing you'll find in the environs of Zurich to a scarab. He goes to the window, catches the beetle in his large hands, holds it out. The woman says, "Here is your scarab." And a breakthrough is accomplished. The treatment now works. Whatever denial, whatever resistance was in her is gone, because Jung seized the moment of synchronicity and acted it, used it as an opportunity. So you understand that. So reading that book, and there are lots of other things by Jung you can read, and actually very interesting things have been coming out since his death. I do not recommend reading the black books because I'm crazy. I got the black books, which came out recently. They're very depressing. The one volume introduction by Shamdasani is magnificent, but the black books themselves, his developing his practice of active imagination, are harder to read than the red book. I mean, this is really for self-punishment, I would say, but for pleasure as well as for instruction. Memories, dreams.
Do you remember when you read it?
Well, if I look at my copy, I can tell you when I got that copy and read it, which was probably about 1980. But I think I read it earlier than that. I'm pretty sure I read it earlier than that. But I don't, because I have all these books, I'll look at them. I used to sign my name in my books. And when I signed my name, that puts it in a certain time period. I used to date when I bought a book and when I read it. I stopped doing that long ago. I'll tell you this, when my signature is legible, particularly if it says RJ instead of Robert Mouse, I know that is from the period of my life before the age of 21, because that's when I called myself RJ. And that's when my writing was truly legible. But I don't know when I first read Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I know when I came back to it. I came back to it in a very big way in the same period that the Mohawk clan mother was calling me, which was the period which shook whatever surface reality I thought I was in. I've always been a dreamer, but I've done different things in my life. I've valued different things in my external life. The period of all the psychic shocks and spiritual awakenings and powerful introductions from non-ordinary reality was one in which I needed anchors. I needed handholds. And that book for me became extraordinarily important in the mid-1980s, really in 1986 to 1988, which was, in Jungian terms, in Jung's language, a period of my big-time confrontation with the unconscious. And that was one of the books that helped me through.
Powerful. So book number 6 is Seth Speaks by Jane Roberts, which comes up again and again in people's lists. And it's interesting how it impacted people. So tell us your experience with this book.
Well, I'll tell you how I came to the book, because it's an amusing story. And I'll also say that I hesitated between putting Seth Speaks and putting The Education of Oversoul 7 on my list. Oversoul 7, as you know, was Jane Roberts. She had a very considerable mind of her own. She wasn't just a channeler. It was her own attempt to put in a lively fictional format what she was learning from Seth and what she discovered herself about how we are connected to many life experiences in past and future, and it's all going on now. I considered that. Well, I'd had some resistance to channeled material. That might be partly because my mother's aunt, who was a famous opera singer, friend and understudy for Nellie Melba, and also on the QT, a very gifted psychic medium, read the tea leaves for me in the old-fashioned way in Perth, Australia, when I was 3 years old, turned white, left the room, wouldn't speak, told my mother later that she'd seen my death. She was correct. That's the winter that followed. I was pronounced clinically dead. What she didn't see was that I came back. But I've often wondered whether my early resistance to channeled material might have been conditioned by that. Anyway, I didn't want to hear about channeled material. But I'd been on a holiday in Brazil where I met a very lively Latin lady who turns up in my county when I'm at the farm and says, "Can I come and visit?" "Oh, certainly." And here's Romelia at the door of the farmhouse. She screams from the doorway before entering, Roberto, you have to read Jane Roberts. Read Seth Speaks. Do it immediately." What? I'm in the midst of this period of psychic storms, and I'm trying to find a model of reality, again, an anchorage, a mental anchorage for all these experiences. Anyway, so she shrieks and squeals at me about Seth Speaks and Jane. I get the book. I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned. It was, for me, the clearest model of understanding of what was going on in my life, and indeed of the nature of multidimensional reality, the multidimensional self, period. You know, I mean, I know from my life that, at least for me, my current dramas are mixed up with dramas that are going on in other places and times. For me, past time, parallel time, maybe future time as well. Seth encouraged me to understand that we don't have to stick to a linear view of these things. You know, if I'm connected to that Scottish druid around the year 600 who went and lived wild with the deer for a while after the defeat of the last pagan king of his part of the world, if I'm connected to that fellow in the raven cloak, okay, fine. Well, maybe it's going on at the same time. Maybe I can reach to him, and maybe he can reach to me across time and place, and maybe we are part of a wheel, actually a sphere, a multidimensional sphere of connections. And Seth helped me to understand that it's all going on now from a larger viewpoint. He also helped me to understand and confirm for me that we can step in and out of time as thinkers, as dreamers, as minds that are not bound to the body and brain except by our lack of imagination, our lack of courage. He also gave me the model of what being a really interesting multi-dimensional teacher might be like. Of course, he's not bound to a body or to one identity or one form of appearance, but I really sort of liked his shtick. I mean, I liked the way he was doing things. I liked the way he was communicating with people. I liked the way he was operating in different dimensions with different people at the same time. So this was one of the great confirmations for me that if I was going crazy, I was in very good company, and that there was a way of appreciating our connection with personalities across time and place, which went beyond the plod linear karmic model. That might be part of it too. There's tick-tock time and there might be linear karma. It's not saying it doesn't exist. But what Seth made me understand is, you know, the moment of power is our moment of power. He also made me understand certain things about reality creation that I think are for real, that what you build in the inner world, what you build in the realm of true imagination can manifest in this world, and that's where we should do a lot more work. He's also a big dreamer, and he gives us very specific instructions on how we should approach sleep and dreams, also confirming for me, I've never been someone who goes to bed and sleeps for 6 hours or more. Never. No point in my life. Not just because I was sick. I've always been a biphasic or polyphasic sleeper, and although I wouldn't push this on anyone else, Seth says very clearly, you want to dream more? You want to remember more dreams? Break up your periods of sleep. Have 2 periods of sleep and some space in between. You'll find that you have many more dreams and you're doing more interesting things. So this was a confirmation more than a revelation, and a map for the journey.
And you relate in one of your books the story of how you reached back to your own younger self.
Yes. I actually think I started doing that in the period I'm talking about. I started doing that really in earnest, consciously, by the end of the 80s, around 1990. That's the period I was 30. My goodness. Where'd the years go, Sandie? Did you hide them? Where did those 30 years go? So around that time, I became very clear to me that we can reach to our younger or older self, and it actually became clear to me around the same time we can reach to a parallel self who's following a different life track. It's all interesting. But what I started doing was I started journeying back quite consciously to sick, lonely Robert, and basically trying to buck him up, cheer him up, and say, look, mate, you're going to get through. I know you're sad. You know, I know you're lonely, but I promise you, you'll know the love of women. They'll love you, and you'll have really good friends. I know it's hard to talk about your dreams and visions. My parents were good people, but they couldn't cope with the dreams and visions. They couldn't really understand that. I say, I promise you the day will come. A lot of people will want to hear your dreams and visions, so stick with it. I also invited him to eat crumpets. You know, you know what crumpets are. Many Americans, they're thinking these muffins are crumpets, and they're absolutely not. But growing up in Australia, we knew what crumpets were. I said, you know, I know Mum likes them with jam and so on. Try them with salt and pepper. They're really good. I gave him that bit of advice because I have a salty, I have a very salty palate, not a sweet palate. And you could say that this is self-delusion or self-hallucination. I actually don't think so. I think I have memories. I think I have authentic memories as young Robert receiving an unseen visitor who'd sit down on his bed, a big man with rather pink face, a lot of hair, white hair as life went on. backing him up, saying, look, you're going to get through. And by the way, put salt and pepper on the crumpets, give it a shot. So I'm talking now about, as the present Robert of a certain age, about a 30-year younger Robert who started going back in time to a much younger Robert, back in the period when he was, say, 9 years old, which is when I was considered to be clinically dead again under a surgeon's knife and an emergency appendectomy. I did have a really difficult childhood. But in that period, it was, I believe, amongst other guides and other gifts, it was an older self trying to reach back, trying to help him through, who became one of the most important invisible supporters. And if you read the Seth material and look at the Jane Roberts fictionalization of it, you have a model of understanding these things.
Yeah. Yes, I remember that in your book. Did you ever ask your mother, was there a time when I had crumpets with salt and pepper?
Oh, yes. She remembered it. We used to go to Myers department store in Melbourne. I don't know whether Myers is still there. One of the treats, we'd go in an afternoon and we'd have tea and crumpets. And she remembers me having, to her surprise, salt and pepper instead of jam or something on my crumpet.
Imagine the conversation that followed. Yes, Mum, this man came and told me. This man from the future.
I never told her that. I never told her. It's interesting about families, isn't it? My mother really only started opening up after my father's death, particularly after my father came to me following his death in a dream, a big dream for the family's survival, with specific guidance for my mother. She listened to that, she acted on it, and after that she opened up a lot more. But it took that point of opening.
Yes, isn't it interesting, the secret lives that we have that our families know nothing about?
Well, my parents tried hard. I grew up in a military family. I mean, in other words, pretty conservative, and Australia was pretty closed, pretty white Australia, pretty racist, pretty xenophobic. They're good people. They supported me, and they absolutely did not understand what was going on. The first person I knew, and I was an army officer's son, so unless I agreed to stay in boarding schools, which I absolutely refused to do, I would not stay in a boarding school. And since I was so sick, they didn't feel that they could keep me there. I moved from school to school, so I don't have a stable group of friends. I don't have one particular confidant. The only person I remember from early childhood who could confirm my experience was an Aboriginal kid, and I wasn't supposed to hang out with them because Australia was reflexively racist. I mean, they weren't evil. They just, they were not the right people. And I'd tell him some of my dreams, and he'd say, oh, yeah, very matter of fact, oh, yeah, we do that. We get sick. We go and live with the spirits for a while, don't we? When we come back, sometimes we're the same, sometimes we're not. And my uncle Fred, the artist, if he wants to get a picture that's a real picture, not a picture for the tourists, he goes into the dreaming. That's where he gets the real picture. So I was hearing from what might be the oldest ongoing tradition of dreaming and just about anything else that, this is for real. No big deal, actually. You're not really human if you don't understand this and do it, because it's part of human nature. So, I mean, that was somewhat steadying, but then I needed Jung and I needed Seth and I needed other things,
Yeah.
I needed books because I'm a reader, and in modern society, we need the text as well as the idea.
And the next book, number 7, this has popped up once or twice before, but not often. Winged Pharaoh by Joan Marshall Grant, written in 1938, about farm memory.
Joan Grant. What an extraordinary lady she was. I mean, she came out of top drawer, upper crust English society, wealthy socialite family. Her father was also a scientist, and he was formed at the leadership of mosquito extermination because he bought a large property in an area heavily affected by mosquitoes in the UK, and then had to figure out how to get rid of the mosquitoes. Anyway, she came out of this enchanted sort of social environment, but was always psychic, was always gifted. And when she came out with Winged Pharaoh, I mean, people loved it. It was published as a novel. It was only later on that she revealed how it came to her. It came to her not when she was in Egypt for 2 weeks with her husband, who was in some kind of archaeological dig, as I recall. It came when she was back in the UK, back in England, and someone handed her a blue scarab beetle, an amulet. She took the blue scarab and suddenly she's thrown, by her own account, in a memoir called Farm Memory, into the life of an Egyptian princess, really, an Egyptian noble, the daughter of an Egyptian nobleman and nomarch, leader of one of the nomes in Egypt. And we follow the adventures of Sakita as a fictional character, and all of this seems fine. But what the story is really about is the training of a dreamer in the precinct of Anubis. Anubis is seen to be the patron of dreams, which we know from some of the archaeology, at least the informed archaeology, is true, because Anubis stands between the living and the dead. He's a guardian of travel between the worlds. He's associated with Orion and the trip to the Sirius star system. He's a patron of astral travel, travels in the soul. So in the precinct of Anubis, we follow the education of a young Egyptian dreamer whose first assignment is to record in the morning the dreams she remembers on, I think it's on a wax tablet in this version, and take it to the priest, who is the big dreamer, for discussion. And then the priest of Anubis starts giving her assignments. Okay, tonight I want you to go somewhere and find something, and then come back, and if it's not with you in your hand, go and find it, in the complex and bring it to me. So I want you to bring me, blue beads or something rather. So she dreams this, she goes looking for the beads, she brings them to him. Okay, you did that. Let's do something else. I want you to go and travel to Alexandria. I want you to go and travel to Byblos. I want you to travel somewhere. So we follow step by step someone who's being trained to travel in her dreams and to do assignments. And the assignments get more and more interesting because very quickly we find her meeting people who have died and might be lost and confused, or dealing with people who've lost someone they love and don't understand that they can communicate with them in dreams. So we see her very early in age, taking on the role of a psychopomp. In other words, a kind of soul guide of souls, who mediates and facilitates communication between the living and the dead in a way that is helpful to both sides in finding their way. So when I discovered this book, I loved it. I mean, many of us have some kind of Egyptian memory or some kind of Egyptian imagination. Many of us do. I mean, I've felt connected to Egypt in 2 or 3 periods. 3 periods, really, most of my life. And I was not surprised to discover that although she publishes fiction, it actually came to her as a past life memory. I mean, a very extensive past life memory, and the way that the pages came to her, and the way that she'd be helped by one or other of her husbands. She had a few husbands. She's a very attractive woman, very hungry woman. The way the pages came through was really very interesting. And she was a best-selling author in her day. This was wildly popular. And then she came out with a whole series of them. There's another one called Eyes of Horus, set in Egypt, and there's one set in France, and there's one set in the ancient world, and in and out of the realms of Asclepius and characters like that. All good stuff. And as I followed her life and learnt more about her, again, I felt affinity. I felt deep affinity for this extraordinary woman. With all these adventures in ordinary reality and in the imagination. I would come back to the idea from time to time that this is all great as a description of a past life and as living history where you brought it alive because of what she called far memory. But what about the idea that it's also a life that is one of many that, like spokes of a wheel, connected to each other across time and place, with at the center a hub personality like the one that Jane Roberts called the Oversoul? What about that? I don't know that she ever really thought about that, or if she did, I don't know that she ever really wrote about it. I've talked to people who knew her very well. That didn't seem to be quite where her mind went, but my fascination with her far memory of previous lives and previous times rubbed up against, in a happy way, in a benign way, with the idea, and slightly impatient idea, well, what if it's not just going on then, but it's going on now? What if you and this Egyptian dreaming priestess are connected right now? What if you can reach to each other right now? And what if you are connected by a central personality that might sort this out in some interesting way?
Have you ever read the book, The Search for Seti?
Yes, yeah.
Mm. That's what what you've just been saying brought to my mind.
I have no doubt that people have very detailed and specific past life memories. I have very detailed and specific past life memories of the Irishmen who came to the American colonies in the 1700s and lived with the Mohawk. In fact, I had to write really 3 historical novels with lots of notes at the back to separate my life from his. Do I regard him as a previous incarnation? No, I regard him as a related personality. It's a slightly different attitude. But certainly I know things of his life and was driven to study his life as a historian and researcher, and also noticed how relationship issues and so on from his life were playing in my own life. So I know that. From my boyhood, I had the memories of a Royal Air Force pilot who knew Dion Fortune in the 1930s. Getting shivers as I say this. and I remembered things of his life. And actually, I tended to sort of avoid researching his life in a lot of detail because he died rather close to my birth at the hands of the Gestapo in the Netherlands. And in a sense, I didn't want to feel trapped in the memory of a very interesting life. However, I didn't learn to fly. I didn't learn to fly airplanes, but I did follow him down other paths, and that's part of the Dion Fortune and connection and other things. And I write about him a little bit in my spiritual thriller, my spiritual memoir, The Boy Who Died and Came Back, the pilot.
Which is a fascinating book, by the way. Everybody should read it.
So I'm better than an agnostic when it comes to past life experience. Yes, I think we do have past life experience. I think they're part of the game that we're playing. But I refuse to be bound to a linear idea of karma. I refuse to believe it's only playing out in linear time. I want to believe, and I do believe, that we can step outside these linear patterns, rise to the perspective maybe of a slightly higher self, like the Oversoul, and try to operate from that level and do some good for each other, backwards and forwards across time. I hope.
I agree. Book number 8 is The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism by Henry Corbin.
Well, I wanted to mention Suhrawardi. Suhrawardi was a great mystic, a great, really Iranian Persian mystic of the 14th century who was murdered by the judicial executioners of Sunni Islam, Sharia law, back in that period because they thought the caliph's son was listening to him and the whole caliphate would go mystic, and this would not be okay in terms of the future of Islam. He was I mentioned Henri Corbin's book because Henri Corbin was French, despite the spelling of his first name, he's French. Henri Corbin was a great interpreter and student of the medieval Persian, particularly Persian, Islamic mystical traditions, and his books mediate, what they were saying. I wanted to give you a book by Suhrawardi, but I couldn't find anything that anyone would be able to read, except, funnily enough, a book of his mystical tales published by a little outfit on Great Russell Street opposite the British Museum, where I found it many years ago, called, Souvenir Books, Octagon Books. It's used both stamps. It's called something like Mystical or Legendary Tales of Suhrawardi, but I couldn't find a book by Suhrawardi. So I gave you a book by Henri Corbin, which has a lot about him. Henri Corbin is also distinguished for introducing a phrase through the translations of his work into the English language, which is really useful. The phrase is imaginal realm. It's becoming increasingly popular. Yes. It really started entering the vocabulary through essays of Corbin, probably 30 years ago, and I wrote about it extensively in some of my earlier books like Dreamgates. I've been using it for a long time. It refers to a realm of true imagination, the kind of place where real creators, poets, mystics, shamans have always wanted to go, where you have access to wise teachers from beyond our realm, and where the shape of things, the forms of things might be created before they take on physical manifestation. It's also a place where you meet the enlightened deceased, the great teachers from amongst the deceased. Anyway, Suhrawardi, for me, has been a huge influence. I've dreamed of him. I've had visions involving his realm. And one of his great teachings was, to use a popular Sufi phrase, our true life teacher, our true guide, our truest guide is no stranger. It is the soul of the soul. Here we go with the idea of the higher self or the oversoul again. He wrote a magnificent invocation to the captain of the soul or the soul of the soul, the Gabriel of my being is another way that they talk about it. Lift the veils of darkness from my heart. Show me the radiance of your dazzling face. This is his way of talking to the soul of the soul and opening a path by which you rise on the beam of longing to know the beloved of your soul from your heart, and it rises up, and like an answering fire from heaven, like a finger of light coming down, it meets the yearning from your heart, and where the fire from heaven and the yearning of your heart meet, there's a place of radiant encounter with the soul of the soul on the level where you can reach it now. But I couldn't find anything that really conveys this in one book in a simple enough way. I mean, Suhrawardi was a great traveler, a great astral traveler, a great celestial traveler. He's one of those people who really got out and about beyond the body and other realms of existence. But his work is almost completely inaccessible, apart from a few parables and fables. But it is mediated. It's still not an easy read. I mean, Corbin, like Jung, expects you to know Latin and Greek and six modern European languages, which is not necessarily going to translate. But I wanted, because we're talking about influences on life, things that guide your life passage, I wanted something that would enable me to bring in Surawadi, one of the great mystical figures in religious and spiritual tradition. And this was the easiest way I could find to do it.
Mm. Imaginal realm, this is something that Jean Houston talks about a great deal and has made very popular.
I love Jean. She's done such good work. And actually, when we're talking about Odysseus, the first secondary work I ever found, which is really good on this, was a book by Jean Houston called The Hero and the Goddess. It's based on a retreat that she led. And she focuses in, homes in exactly on what I was trying to convey when I talked about that relationship of the hero and the goddess. So she's very good on these things.
Yes, she's just...
By the way, Jean called me a mythic link. Did you see that in the back of my book, Mysterious Realities? She describes me not as a missing link, but as a
mythic link.
Mythic link.
Of course she would. Of course she would. Have you read her autobiography?
Yes.
Yeah. There's not many books that make me laugh out loud. But, you know, her sense of timing, you know, her sense of her comedic humor. I mean, she's just brilliant.
She is great. She has given us a great deal, and she's given us this great push, you know, to go mythic. I just have to give you an anecdote from my life on the road before the pandemic. I used to travel 60% of the time. I'd get on and off airplanes every week. So I'm Australian, I have a beer if I can, and I'm sitting at an airport bar somewhere or other, changing planes. And there's a lady who says to me, I don't know whether to have wine or to have beer. I said, well, it depends who you're trying to placate. If you want to please the god, I'd have wine. If you want to please the goddess, I'd have beer. And this starts a conversation about the role of wine and beer in different offering traditions. And the man down the stool along the bar says to the bartender, I'll have whatever the mythic guy is having. I'll have what the mythic guy is having.
Very good. Now, the Blue Island. This is an interesting one. I was doing a search for it and I couldn't find mention of it in many places. I think I found something that was really not very inviting on Amazon, but then I actually found the whole book as a PDF on a website. And it looked as though it had been scanned from the original because the typeface was very, very old. So this one actually said, the Blue Island, experiences of a new arrival beyond the veil, communicated by W.T. Stead with a letter from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, so I love the Victorian ghost hunters. And Stead was prominent. He was a social reformer, muckraking journalist, all sorts of things. He held seances in his home. I love this whole group, Frederick Myers, the whole Gurney, the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. And those who came a little bit later, I've been studying Winifred Coombe Tennant, magnificent social lady, a very gifted psychic of a slightly later period. But Stead's book, The Blue Island, which purports to be, and I think actually is, his account of transition states shortly after physical death, is possibly my favorite single book about the afterlife. There are lots of books about the afterlife. There are lots of people who've died and come back in some sense or another. This probably is still my favorite book. Stead went down in the Titanic. It's funny that he did, because 20 years before he went down in the Titanic, he'd written a short story which seemed to be precognitive. It's about a supposedly unsinkable ship called the Majestic, which hits an iceberg and goes down, and the name of the captain in his story is the name of the captain on the Titanic. So in some sense, he knew 20 years ahead, but if it's 20 years ahead, how do you keep up with your premonitions? So he goes down the Titanic, and he proceeded to do what all these characters involved in the Society for Psychical Research in this phase of paranormal experiment promised to do. He tried to deliver an account from the other side of what was going on. They all promised to do this. They came back through mediums, Myers, Gurney, they all came through. Some of them dictated books. So Myers dictated this book, The Blue Islands, to male medium sitting in the presence of his daughter. So his daughter gives this sort of like the emotional charge in the space, and the men are taking the dictation. And it's very brisk, very clear, very journalistic account of what it's like arriving on the other side, being greeted, being welcomed, being given a tour of the premises. He's a journalist, so he's very interested in communications. So he goes to a communications center to see how, people who are dead in the eyes of the living try to get in touch with people who are alive. He says it's actually much easier than people think. I mean, if you just focus your mind on someone, whether you're living or dead, quote unquote, you can get through to them some way or other. We have special messengers and we have sort of priorities. So I love its brisk, no-nonsense approach to what life is like in this transition state. And he says quite clearly, this is a transition state. I haven't been here very long. I'm going to be going somewhere else afterwards. But this is how it is for now. And it's called the Blue Island because everything is suffused by this kind of soft blue glow. There's that quality to it. We see him encountering family members. We see him exploring what kind of line of study, what kind of rest and relaxation, what kind of remedial treatment people might receive on the other side. And I like it for its very no-nonsense, simple account of what the early stages of transition after death might be like. Is it dated? Well, slightly, but not all that much. I think if you were kicking off today, you might find you have some things in the way of architecture and technology that Stead wasn't looking for. But as I say, I think it's very important for us to check out the possibility that we do go somewhere after death, and we might be in a certain kind of living situation, and to know something about that before we embark on that big journey. And The Blue Island is certainly a book it's going to open your sensitivity to what is possible.
Book number 10. This is one that has appeared many times on people's lists. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
I reread this book probably every 4 years. I can't remember when I first read it, probably back when I was a student in university. If you don't know Viktor Frankl's story, it's really interesting. He was a successful Jewish psychiatrist in Vienna. Then the Nazis came and they took him off to the death camps. And now he's a walking skeleton, the tattoo on his arm. He can be killed or beaten up at any moment. Everybody's dying. What does he do? He uses his imagination. He settles in whatever quiet space he can find with the screaming and the horror around him. And he practices growing a vision of the possible future. In the possible future, not only is Hitler gone, not only the Nazis a memory, but he is back in a good suit giving a lecture to a well-heeled audience, and the lecture is on the psychology of the concentration camps. Can you imagine? I mean, imagining yourself not only surviving, but being able to have such objectivity, such distance from the horror, to be able to talk about the psychology of the concentration camps. So he applies himself again and again to growing this vision. And 1 year after the war, not only has he survived, but the dream is being manifested around him. He's in that suit, he's in front of that audience, he's giving that lecture exactly as he imagined it. So I draw from this a number of critical lessons. First of all, we can, whatever our situation, we have the freedom to choose our attitude, and that can affect everything. He chose his attitude. Secondly, whatever horrors we think we're going through, many of us are going through tragedy and pain and horror, one kind or another. Frankly, very few of us are going through something quite as nightmarish as Auschwitz during World War II. I mean, there are people who are going through that, but most of us who are discussing things and reading books are not going through something quite as bad as that. Therefore, there's comfort in the idea, okay, we've got it bad, it's hard, but it's not that bad. And if he could adjust his attitude, maybe I can adjust my attitude too. And the third lesson is that we can make inner films, we can produce inner movies that can be an exercise in reality creation. Maybe if we can envision something strong enough and put enough of our inner senses and our belief into it, maybe it will take form in the physical world. That's what happened to Frankl. And I think that might be more possible for us than we sometimes allow ourselves to believe. So that would always be on my list of 10, no matter what the basis for putting the list together would be, one of the 10 essential books.
I read a book for somebody I was interviewing a few years ago, and they told a story of a man who had been a very bad boy. He got into all kinds of trouble, an English guy. He was drug running, he was doing everything. He got caught, he got thrown in prison in some third world country, and he was completely on his own. And what he did every day was he played golf in his mind. When he came out, he became a yoga teacher, completely reformed, and his handicap had gone up.
I love it. Whatever works. I mean, I love it. Why not play golf? Why not?
Why not? Why not indeed?
Yoga.
So of all the people that we've talked about tonight, who would you most like to sit down and have dinner or a drink with?
Well, I'm hesitating because, you see, part of me would like to sit down with Jung, but I think part of me would very much like to sit down with Joan Grant. I mean, she was such a lively, social, bubbling lady. I think that she would be an incredibly interesting dinner companion. And I'd also like to talk about that theme that we discussed together. Okay, we're connected to that past life in Egypt. How about the idea that if we can remember that, we can also reach into that mind as it can reach into ours, and we're connected to ourselves on a higher level. So I think it would be engaging, because she has a fund of wonderful stories. If you read her memoirs, they're also full of hilarious tales from her life. It'd be nice to see what Jung's been up to. Actually, I have seen some of the things that Jung is up to. I wrote a story called The Other Bollingen, which is in Mysterious Realities, about what Jung might be doing now, including the purple book, not the red book or the black book, but the purple book, whose introduction is entitled Why I Am Not a Jungian.
Have you ever written about somebody who had been living or is alive, and then had them come to you in a dream and say, no, that's wrong, or you did good?
It's a very interesting question. I think the answer is probably yes, in the sense that I think not quite like that. The way you put it was very effective and very dramatic, but not so much like that as, okay, I see it this way, or there's something here that you haven't understood. And sometimes it's put in a slightly different way, as if that person is now reviewing their own memories of the situation, and that their understanding of what was going on in their life when they were still living is not their understanding now, because they're looking at the story with objectivity. It doesn't mean that I either got it right or got it wrong, but it means that they're looking at how they themselves might have got it right or got it wrong before they checked out. Yeats is a great guide on this theme too, because he suggested that one of the things that goes on after death is we go through a phase of what he called dreaming back. And what he was saying was, one of the things that we have to do after this life is sort out the story of the life we left behind. What really was going on? What was its logic or lack of logic? Let's have a look at things. And one of the reasons why the dead come into the dreams of the living, according to Yeats, is they want to review with the living, get together with the living on some plane to review again the incidents, the narrative of a life, and get the story straight. So I've had the experience of people who have been maybe reviewing not only my take or my writing about their life, but at the same time reviewing their own understanding of what was going on in that period of the life, if you follow me. I think I've had that experience with the Irishman I talked about from the 1700s. I went into his life in great detail. I attributed certain things to him. I think he sort of gently pushed me a little bit to think, well, that wasn't quite the way that it was. He's pleased where I've promoted him. But at the same time, I feel him looking at his own life from his own perspective. Very interesting question.
So what are you reading now, or what is Lucy having you read now?
Well, I'm having well, Lucy will choose. I'm reading. My reading and research is focused in three areas at the moment. The first is Norse mythology. Many of my ancestors are Scandinavian, but I often, rebuff the opportunity to really study the Scandinavian traditions. Probably the Viking shadow was part of that. But I've been going at the Norse mythology with all sorts of sources and all sorts of recent books, including wonderful ones by British archaeologists called Neil Price. Another is Borges, the great Jorge Luis Borges, who's my all-time favorite writer. And the books that he regarded his precursors, one of the interesting things that Borges said was, writers can create their precursors. In other words, if you're a writer, you can choose who might have been an influence on you in the past. And three of the sources that really dominated his imagination were Beowulf, and the Arabian Nights, and Robert Louis Stevenson. So that's area 2. Area 3 is not so much Stead and Myers at the end of the 19th century, but the slightly younger group of British psychic researchers who appeared in the early 20th century, 1910 through 1950, really, and produced the most astonishing material involving communication between the living and the dead. And my favorite amongst them is someone called Winifred Coombe Tennant. I read an extraordinary book called Swan on a Black Sea by an Irish psychic called Geraldine Cummins, which has the scripts that she was able to receive from Winifred when she was on the other side. In life, Winifred was a very potent psychic. She's also a social woman of some standing, and she has to be very quiet about what she's doing in the Society of Psychical Research. So I've been reading an immense amount of material, including her diary, researching this group of people. They fascinate me. What am I going to do with? Well, I published a few articles. Maybe I'll do something more. So those are three core areas of research and reading. And around that, I grabbed this and that. I started reading a fantasy writer I hadn't read recently called Robin Hobb. She's rather good.
My favorite. My favorite.
Well, I've just discovered it. So I'm just, there you are, synchronicity. There's synchronicity.
She's my gold standard. Actually, one series is my gold standard.
On the Farseer trilogy or something?
Yes, yes.
Last night, I was reading the first of the Apprentices asked or something, the first of the Farseer trilogy. I love it. It's really great. So I did that. That's literary synchronicity for you, right?
Wait till you get to she's done 3 trilogies.
Yes.
They're all connected. And wait till you get to the Mad Ships. I think when it comes to imagination, and that's something that I'm always, in awe of, is that she seems to have the best imagination, as far as I'm concerned.
She is the reason that I might be suffering from sleep deprivation. I do better than most people, but I started reading her at, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the morning. I keep funny hours. Then I never went back to bed because it just seized me. So
I've done that many times with her book.
Recommendation, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think I just have to buy the rest now.
And I think that's the only writer that I've actually read twice.
Okay. I love it. So there is literary synchronicity in play again.
There you go. Yes, yes. Tell me what you think. And she recently, I think it was last year, after many years, she did a sequel, a final, bringing it all together. So there were 10 books altogether in that whole. And that was brilliant. But it's one of those that those people are real. And everything they did was real. And I want to go back there. Hence reading them again.
I understand it. And they're a quick read, not in the sense of superficial read, but they're an easy read, an enjoyable quick read. So I will some of my reading might sound like pretty heavy stuff to someone who doesn't have the same research focus. I find it fascinating. I don't do anything that doesn't please me, I do the things I choose to do. So, and I take on some lines of somewhat arcane research because I'm called to them, often by my dreams. Often by my dreams give me specific leads. And then around it, I've recently met Matt Haig, the Midnight Library, the Humans.
Yes.
Matt Haig. I discovered Matt Haig last year. So in Robert's typical way, I read all of Matt Haig that I could find. Well, not all. I haven't read all. I've read about 6. Starting with the Midnight Library, which is great in terms of parallel lives and approaching death. Going on to the Humans, which is really fascinating. An alien's forced to operate the human body finds it ugly and disgusting. It's delightfully funny. So I read a great deal of fiction. I haven't published fiction for a while. I keep thinking about it, yet somehow it hasn't sort of seized me. I like to be seized, and then I go all out, but I haven't been seized. I wrote some stories of mysterious reality that probably could have been published as fiction, but we published them as visionary narratives, I guess.
Tell me about your radio show. Are you still doing it, The Way of the Dreamer?
Yes, it's really in a sandbox. I do it once a month, and I'll have a guest, and we'll talk about things. But where I'm most active is with all these online courses that I do. I'm constantly doing online courses for the Shift Network. We're about to launch another one this month called Dreaming Your Mythic Life. And I'm actually doing one for Alternatives in London, where Alternatives hosted my programs in England in the past. We did one last year, which is very popular. We're doing an alternatives course starting on Friday called something like Dream Archaeology and Ancestral Healing. That's 3 classes over 3 evenings. So I've been doing a great deal on Zoom. I've been doing online courses, many of them for 6 years. But in this era, obviously, it's the main platform that we have. So I'm doing more than ever.
Yeah, we had Malcolm Stern on a few weeks ago.
Okay.
Yes, I didn't realise that Alternatives were still doing their courses online and their events. Well, too busy doing my own stuff online to look at everybody else's.
Well, we had a very good time last year. I think it's probably in October, and we're doing we're doing a new one starting on Friday called Dream Archaeology and Ancestral Healing.
The ancestral healing, I think, is so important, and we're hearing more and more about it now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the ancestors are calling us in three senses: the ancestors of our bloodlines, the ancestors of the lands where we live and travel, and the ancestors of our spiritual connection across time and place. Three ways that the ancestors are engaging with us, whether we like it or not. It's probably better to be conscious about it, to cut relations with those that are not helpful, and to engage in deeper relations with those with whom wisdom and healing is possible.
You also wrote, when you were giving me the written version of your 10 best list, that you know that the most important book you will ever write, and one of the most important you will ever read, is your own journal.
Yes. Keeping a journal has been my daily practice off and on since I was a teen, and for the last 35 years I've done it with passionate dedication. And my journal is not just a journal of dreams. However, if I remember dreams, which I usually do, often said several times during the night or morning, I'll write them down first. But my journal is, I'll write my observations, I'll write quotations, I'll write my book reports I'm currently reading. I'll write all sorts of things. When I'm traveling in the outside world, there'll be lots of synchronicity, encounters with strangers on airplanes or airports or something like that. It is the book of your soul. It's a workout if you're a writer. And sometimes what you write in your journal might even be the best thing that you're going to write, or a draft of something you will publish. And you'll discover over time that you've constructed a personal encyclopedia of symbols. You'll discover you're interested in such things that you have a personal scientific data log, experiences like precognition and telepathy and things like that, other supernormal facilities that might be playing in your life. And so this is the book. And when I was asked to think about 10 books, I was very tempted to put some journals in the list. For example, Mircea Eliade, the great Romanian scholar of religion and shamanism, also a fantastic novelist and fantasy writer, by the way. Eliade, like me, thought that the journal was the most important book. In fact, he said that his most important literary contribution would be an unending journal. And his journals and autobiographies are fascinating reading. So not only do I like keeping my own journal, I like reading the journals of other interesting people, particularly writers.
What are you going to do with your journals and your 14,000 library when you shuffle off this mortal coil?
Pushing me out.
Would you leave it to me?
You're pushing me out the door already,
I just think it would be absolutely fascinating to work one's way through your library and read some of the comments and the things that you've marked in those books.
It would, and the short answer is I don't know yet. I mean, I have daughters, and they will. I have a wife. I mean, they will be the principal heirs. What we do with different sections of the library, who is in charge of what is done with my journals, I haven't quite decided yet. The problem is the people that most readily spring to mind are about my age. So we're looking at each other. Well, will it be you? But who's going to check out first? So those are good questions. My journals will be preserved somewhere or other. My library will probably be broken up into different segments, and probably I'll leave different segments of it to different people who have a particular need for or interest in different sections of it, ranging from, classical literature to the anthropology of Iroquois to Mr. Jung.
Do you ever loan any of them out?
No. If I want someone to read a book, I'll give it to them. I'll buy it. Right. I don't loan books, and I don't borrow books, unless the book is absolutely unobtainable, and someone goes to extraordinary lengths to share her copy with him, which someone did recently. The book was absolutely unobtainable, at great pain, great difficulty. She sent me her copy. It's a very precious book, but that was an unobtainable book, unfindable anywhere. So she loaned me her copy, but normally I won't accept a loan. Okay, if I want to read the rest of Robin Hobb, I'll buy them. I won't ask you to lend me your copies, but I absolutely will not lend books. I often buy other copies for other people, though. Instead of just recommending the book, I say, okay, I want you to read this. Here it is. That I do. So
before we close, would you just tell everybody where they can find out more about your workshops and your courses, your books?
My website is mossdreams.com. That's very simple. I have various Facebook pages. One is called Robert Moss Books on Facebook. Mastersdreams.com will give you a complete guide to my current relevant books. For one thing, it'll tell you about the online courses that I'm leading, and we're actually doing a. I think you've missed this now. I think we're doing a free. Oh no, maybe you haven't. Maybe it's a bit later UK time. We're doing actually a free mini workshop introducing the new course for the Shift Network, Dreaming Your Mythic Life. I think that actually is going out later today. Anyway, you can see that for free. It's a rather lively 1 hour mini workshop. I take you on a journey with 2 ravens to look at what lies ahead or behind you across time. So there's a little shamanic journey in which I'm drumming for you, and you're borrowing thought and memory, the ravens of the shaman god of the north, to go on a journey across time.
And the ravens are, I have a connection with ravens. And I have to tell you that after I interviewed you for the radio show last year, I have been going to bed with you at night.
Oh,
because
really?
I got some of your CDs as well.
I love it. Again, back in the pre-pandemic era, where a plane has landed, we're getting off. The woman in 2 rows in front says, "You're Robert Moss." See, how do you know? I used to be on TV a lot, but I'm not on TV much these days. "Oh, I've been going to bed with you every night for 3 months. My husband is getting quite jealous." She's been listening like you to my audio programs. So
Yes.
it's funny. In the old days, I was on television. A lot of people know my face. Now they don't particularly know my face, but they know my voice.
They know your voice.
I do, and I do also audio versions of my books, which people seem to like. They sort of like this in the Anglo-Australian accent.
Have you got another book on the go?
One you didn't mention, which has just come out, is called Growing Big Dreams. That's the current one. That came out a couple of months ago. I wouldn't say I've got another book on the go yet. I'd say I talked to you about some areas of research and reading interest. I think that something is taking form out of these literary wanderings of mine. There's a tribe in Morocco which values poetry amongst other skills, and they say all poetry comes from flooding. Something builds up in you and has to burst through. I'm a bit like that. I mean, I keep my journal every day, but I'm really not a plodder. I have friends I greatly admire sit down every morning. They write their 500 words or their 750 words, whatever. Graham Greene used to sit down and write 500 words or 750 words every day, whatever else he'd been doing. I admire people like that. I keep my journal, but I don't do that until it seizes me, until I feel the flooding. Now, when the book is ready to come, then I go to day and night, and I do it quite quickly. But it averages out as slower probably than someone who sits down every morning to turn out their draft. I mean, I have to be seized.
Yes.
When I'm seized, I give everything to it. And I feel at this stage in my life, I need to write something different, whether I want a third genre. I want a genre that's not fiction or nonfiction. I want something in between, real books that are about a reality that is neither fiction nor nonfiction. I think I want to travel firmly into that territory. I made a start with the stories in Mysterious Realities, which, as I say, were published as nonfiction. They could have been published as fiction, might have been more successful as such. But they're simply my travels. And when I say my travels, I mean in the imaginal realm, in realms of the dead, personal contacts with goddesses and archetypes and wild boars and other things. I think I want to do something. I think something wants to be done through me beyond, in literary terms, in writerly terms, beyond anything I've done. Something that will be genre busting, at least in terms of my own understanding of my literary life. But I can't say it's on the go at the moment. But I won't say that it's not on the go. I'd say that it's in the offing. It's waiting in the wings.
Well, let us know if that happens, and love to have you back on the radio show as well.
Oh, absolutely. Hi, Sandra. I have to say one last thing to you in response to your question, in response to everything, really. One of the things I carry with me from Australia, I'm a very absentee Aussie, but something Aborigines say, which writers, when they hear it, get excited or terrified by. Aborigines say the big stories are hunting the right people to tell them. The big story, hunting the right, or maybe to live them. I've always felt this to be true. And to be seized, we know this in our lives, don't we? To be seized by a larger story, by a larger power, is to be different. Something comes to you and comes with you that changes it. That's why, to go back to the start of the conversation, that's why when we correctly translate it, the invocation of the muse at the start of the Odyssey is so important. What the writer says is, sing in me, muse. Not sing through me, sing in me, muse, inviting the creative spirit the creative daimon, the muse, to come into the speaker, into the sing in me muse. Moments like that in life are thrilling. Athletes talk about being in the zone. We know it in different walks of life. I think for a writer to be seized in that way by the big story that is now irresistible changes everything, changes the game. And that's a great place to be. I'm not in that place right now, but I'm happy just talking about it.
Robert Moss, thank you. And to you at home, thank you for joining us. And we'll be back again next week with another 10 best spiritual book list.